Okay, hi. So all right, good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening to a small number of the audience who are watching this from the other side of the planet. First of all, thank you very much for coming today, despite your hectic schedule in the middle of a pandemic. I'm Jae-young Shin from Gyeongsang National University, and truly pleased and honored to present to you today's two speakers, Dr. Kitahara and Dr. Seeley. I'll keep this introduction to a minimum, however, as I believe most of you, if not all, are quite familiar with the leading works by Dr. Kitahara and Dr. Seeley, oftentimes in the name of EKS with the late Samuel Epstein, who was my teacher, colleague, and friend, and who we all miss today, I believe. With that said, here's some minimal information, as in minimum merge, about the today's invited speakers. Dr. Kitahara is professor at the Institute of Cultural and Linguistic Studies in Keio University, Japan. Dr. Seeley is professor of linguistics at Eastern Michigan University, USA. Today's talk will consist of a 90-minute or so presentation, followed by a 30-minute or so Q&A session. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kitahara and Dr. Seeley. Thank you. Seeley, we cannot hear you.
Okay, yeah, everything's good. All right,
Good.
I'm just going to share the screen and then we can get started. Okay, so everybody can see the PowerPoint, all right, and hear me. Okay, good. All right, so we'd like to thank the organizers and the sponsors for the conference, Computation for Human Language and Language Use. We really appreciate the invitation, and particular thanks to Professor Jae-young Shin. Really appreciate the invitation and your help and support in this. This is a collaborative effort. We want to acknowledge and thank our co-author for a combined 30 years of work, the late Samuel David Epstein, whom we lost last year. This talk draws heavily from a forthcoming collection of EKS, as Jae-young mentioned, Epstein, Kitahara, and Seeley papers that will be appearing in the fall in a Routledge volume. For extended discussion over the last few years, EKS thanks Noam Chomsky. And then over the last year, we've had the privilege of being able to discuss regularly with Noam and Andrew McInerney, Yushi Sujimoto, Sandawei Fong, Rini Hoybritz, Bob Berwick. And then over the years, we'd like to thank co-authors and people that we've had a chance to talk with, Miki Obata, Chris Collins, Stephanie Boda, Eric Acton, and Jae-young, among others, various members of audiences at conferences that we've presented portions of this material to. So thank you all. It's really great to be part of such a community. Okay, so this talk explores the form and function of the structure building device merge, the most fundamental operation of the narrow syntax, perhaps even the only operation of the narrow syntax. Our broad question for today is, what is the current state of merge and why? So how did we get to that current state? We'll provide a history of structure building devices, from phrase structure rules through X-bar theory to the introduction of merge in Chomsky's important paper, Bare Phrase Structure. Next, we're going to trace what EKS has called the Maximize Minimal Merge program, maximizing the effects of merge while minimizing its form. And we're striving ultimately to the thesis that recursive merge, efficiently meeting conditions imposed by the interfaces of sound and meaning, and obeying, as we would expect, conditions imposed from outside of language, principles of efficient computation, ideally natural laws that are called third factor, that recursion, interacting with the interfaces and obeying the laws of nature just is language in the narrow sense. We'll see successive stages in the development of merge, reaching the most recent characterization, really a reconceptualization of merge referred to as capital merge. You can see all the capital letters there, really the current state of the art, so to speak. And this will be drawing from recent work by Chomsky in lectures and some papers, some of which are still unpublished, and some work by EKS as well. We'll see some empirical consequences, some challenges, and some prospects for the future. So overall, that is the basic plan. We're then going to open the floor for discussion, and we welcome a robust question and answer period. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're up to. So let's set the stage a little bit, turning our attention to the goals and orientation of the generative enterprise. And let me just, okay, just going to get myself a little more space here. Okay, humans have a remarkable capacity for language. As introduced by Noam Chomsky in the mid-20th century, language study is focused on this human capacity, seeking to determine its nature, to characterize the capacity, to establish its properties, and crucially, to explain those properties, or at least take some steps toward explanation. Since its inception, a biolinguistic framework is adopted. The language capacity is assumed to be biologically determined. It's a cognitive capacity present in each individual by virtue of being a Homo sapiens, and it's uniform for the species. It's a part of your body. We seek to construct a theory of this knowledge to characterize its initial state. So a theory of that hypothesized initial state is what's referred to as universal grammar and uniform for the species. And then to characterize states attained upon interaction with the environment. So a human interacts with the environment, they get linguistic input, and we grow basically a particular language. Okay, what we can refer to as an individual I language, like French or Zulu or whatever it happens to be. Crucially, in the present context is that there has been in this framework an unrelenting concern for explanation, asking and attempting to answer questions about why that cognitive faculty, why language has the properties that it does, how the growth of language is possible in the individual, and how it evolved in the species. Now, when have we explained something? That's a very difficult question. But one mode of explanation involves simplicity. What we find through the history of the development of the generative enterprise is a reduction of the inventory of theoretical postulates within the narrow syntax. What was syntax internal and syntax specific, what was language specific and construction specific, the rules of French or the rules of Russian, in earlier stages of the framework was reduced or factored down or eliminated. The effects of these postulates were derived from two things. One of them is the interaction of the narrow syntax with the system that it necessarily interfaces with. The system of sound, sensory, motor, and meaning, the systems of thought, conceptual, intentional. And these earlier postulates were derived ultimately too from general principles of computational systems. So notions of computational efficiency, least effort, for example, and we'll see others as we proceed, a minimality of mechanisms and resources. Ideally, these are the laws of nature, what are referred to as third factor. As John Nash once stated, resolved to maximize our understanding, we find ourselves committed to a highly characteristic effort to minimize the number of theoretical premises required for explanation. As the great physicist Einstein once said, the grand aim of all science is to cover the greatest possible number of empirical facts by logical deduction from the smallest possible number of hypotheses or axioms. And as Chomsky has often stated, it has long been clear that the quest for simplicity is closely related to the quest for explanation. So that's the big picture. That's some of the goals and orientation of the generative enterprise. Let's turn our attention now to structure building, a fundamental component of the syntax, and we're going to work our way through a highly selective and undoubtedly oversimplified history toward the current state of structure building in the form of what we just referred to as capital merge. We start with the long-standing paradox of discrete infinity. While the human brain is finite, the generative capacity of an I language is infinite. Infinite use of finite means is the expression often used for this. The problem, how is it that a finite mechanism can generate an infinite set of linguistic expressions, phrases, and sentences? Chomsky took this infinite use of finite means as the core creative property of human knowledge of syntax. How can you have knowledge of previously unencountered stimuli? And his solution within the early standard theory of the 1960s, say, was the postulation of recursive phrase structure rules. Informally stated, the computational system represented by these phrase structure rules could operate on its own output. So I could have just two phrase structure rules. Let's apply the first one. So I'm going to apply the first one and build that S, simple little sentence like it's raining. Now that's the output of the first rule, and that can serve as input to the second rule. So we apply the second rule, take the output of the first. Now I've built that object. And now that can be input to the first rule, and I can embed it. Bill said it's raining. And I can keep doing this over and over and over, as you know, getting multiple embeddings in there. So recursion provided infinite use of finite means. So recursive phrase structure rules in the standard theory gave us a solution to discrete infinity, and this was an important step. But empirically, the system had to face the pervasive empirical problem of displacement. Phenomenon like who did you visit, where that WH expression is interpreted in this position. It's interpreted as the direct object of that transitive verb, but it's pronounced up here, upstream in the sentence. That's displacement. It's as though the same thing is in two positions at once. So more than just phrase structure rules was needed, it was argued. A different set of operations embodied by a transformational component was required. The transformational component takes phrase markers generated by the phrase structure rules as input, and then it can manipulate them in various ways. And one of those ways is by displacement. So we have a phrase structure component that builds structure, and then we have a transformational component that consists of different, qualitatively different kinds of operations that manipulates that structure. So it can take that as input, and one of the powers of the transformational component would be displacement. So you can see that the structure stays the same, but I can manipulate it. Now, there's structure, transformations manipulated, and what we want to just note now in passing, and then we'll return to it later, is we want to note the oddity of displacement. Why should language have such a thing? In this early stage in the development of the theory, there was no particular answer. It seemed to be empirically necessary, and operations that gave us displacement were stipulated. So the picture at the time was we had these two components, and there's an expression in the States that I want to use here: don't compare apples and oranges. Apples and oranges are two completely different things. You can't compare them, and that's apt in this situation. I've got two completely different components here. So we want to stress that. Now, we did have progress Overall, we have a solution to discrete infinity in these early phrase structure rules of standard theory, and we have a coherent system with wide empirical coverage. But there's this unrelenting quest for explanation, and a series of why questions emerged. Note, for example, that phrase structure rules are completely unconstrained. Anything can be rewritten as anything. Thus, we could have, for example, crazy phrase structure rules like a verb phrase consists of an adjective and a noun phrase. Or a crazy phrase structure rule like a prepositional phrase consists of s and adverb phrase. But certain patterns arose over and over again. For instance, you could have all sorts of material before and after a verb in a verb phrase, but you seem to always find a verb. It was endocentric. And the same with the other major lexical categories. You found a head. Phrase structure rules themselves provided no explanation for this. It was true by stipulation. So we can ask, why does the verb have a verb phrase mother above it? And the answer is because that's the way we define the phrase structure rules. We could just have had a verb phrase consists of adjective plus noun phrase. So why these rules and not others? There was no particular answer to that question. So it was considerations such as these that led to the next stage in the historical development of structure building devices, namely X-bar theory. Rather than unconstrained and stipulated and ultimately non-explanatory phrase structure rules of the standard theory, which, however, did give us a solution to discrete infinity, the X-bar template imposed tight restrictions on what counts as humanly possible phrase structure representation. So phrase structure theories sought to eliminate phrase structure rules, reducing them to just the few that gives us this X-bar template. And it pushed endocentricity to its logical conclusion. Since some categories were endocentric, the lexical categories had a head, it was hypothesized that all categories, including the functional categories, were endocentric as well. So something like adjective phrase consists of N plus prepositional phrase was simply impossible. It didn't conform to the X-bar template that was assumed to be part of universal grammar. So we look inside noun phrase and we see a certain structure in there. We'll represent that abstract structure with a triangle. And then you can look at a verb phrase and that same basic abstract structure was present. At the right level of abstraction, you found a head and a complement and a specifier. Similarly for adjective phrase and for prepositional phrase. So what was distilled out of that was that basic abstract structure represented by the triangle that became that X-bar template. And this led to massive simplification of the system because earlier, what you had were language and construction specific phrase structure rules. So you would have, for example, the phrase structure rules of French or the phrase structure rules of Zulu, and phrase structure rules for particular constructions, the phrase structure rules associated with clefs, for example, and particular categories, the phrase structure rules of VP as opposed to NP. That mass of language particular, construction specific, and language specific rules were reduced down to just the few rules that gave you the X-bar template. So we could eliminate old style phrase structure rules in favor of that template. The other major innovation that we see with X-bar was another kind of simplification, and that's the elimination of linear order. Phrase structure rules simultaneously encoded two relations, dominance relations and precedence relations, and the precedence relations, the linear order was taken out of the system. So what you had with the X-bar template in UG, the initial state would be this. It was, you can think of it as kind of a spinning mobile. The head plus its complement were not linearized initially. So an individual language could linearize that in one of two ways, head first or head final. And then we could go up the X bar spine, and we see the spec and the X bar are also spinning. They're non-linearized. Think of that as a mobile. So the X bar template overall, those things were spinning as part of UG. That's what you're born with. But upon interaction with the environment, they could be linearized in various ways. So I can get subject, verb, object, and subject, object, verb, and so on. So what emerged is a characterization of the initial state, UG, and states attained upon interaction with the environment when we remove linear order. So just to look at this again, and this will become valuable for us a little bit later, if I have a verb phrase, and if it's not linearized, those things are spinning. Well, when I give that to the interface that's associated with thought, with meaning, it doesn't have to be linearized. All the conceptual intentional system cares about is the hierarchical structure. So it's spinning as represented by the green spinning arrows. But when I give it over to the other component, the sensory motor component, I necessarily linearize it. It's in 2 dimensions when I speak. So it's linearized there. So linear order was removed and put into the phonology, the sensory motor side where it seemed to belong. Okay, good. So we see the simplification of the structure building devices, phrase structure rules to X bar. And alongside of this, parallel to this, we see the simplification of the transformational component. So transformations were also language specific and construction specific. You would have a transformational rule associated with Russian, for example, with the question formation construction of Russian, for example, or relative clause formation in Obibio, language specific, construction specific, category specific, and they too were reduced down over time. We looked at the powers of various transformation and factored out what they have in common. And one important stage of that was to factor out different kinds of displacement, so noun phrase movement and WH movement. And then those eventually were factored down into just the most abstract notion of displacement, which is just move alpha. So we still had 2 separate components, but they were each very much reduced. So the phrase structure reduced down to X bar and transformations reduced down to move alpha, but they were distinct. The operations that gave us the X bar template were different than the operations that gave us displacement. It was comparing apples and oranges. Again, we want to stress they were fundamentally distinct. So we had these 2 separate systems. Now, overall, we see the role of simplification. We stress again that rather than language specific and construction specific and category specific, the grammar of French or the rules of Japanese, we see the emergence of very general operations and also the emergence of general principles. So a lot of the work of those very stipulative phrase structure rules and transformational operations was distilled out into general principles, like, for example, subjacency, or the head movement constraint, that were still considered to be part of language, unique to language, but not unique to any particular language. So we had an overall system that involved recursion. We had a theory that emerged of human phrase structure. We had the simplification of the phrase structure rules and transformations too. And critically, we want to stress no linear order, but we still had these 2 components, phrase structure, grammar on the one hand, and the transformational component on the other. Now, again, as just a prelude of things to come, the overall picture at the time, this is roughly in the 1980s, we had a lexicon that consisted of the atomic elements. I reached into the lexicon, I could draw those out, and the lexical elements were given over to a computational system. There were computational devices. And the objects that I build with the computational system are then given over to the interfaces of sound and thought. sensory, motor, and conceptual intentional. And this part right here, that's the narrow syntax that we're focusing on. And there are two computational devices, phrase structure and displacement. And what we see over time is simplification from this to this, simplification from this to this, simplification. The particular rules of French or English and the particular transformational rules and phrase structure rules of different languages were reduced down to just these two. And then surrounding this were these general linguistic principles like subjacency. Okay, so there's the picture in the late 1980s, and it's coherent. It had massive empirical coverage. Progress was made, but we're never satisfied. Further depth of understanding is always possible. But that's where we are in the late 80s, early 90s, at the beginning of the next stage in the development of the generative enterprise, which is sometimes referred to as the minimalist program. Okay, so let's pause for a second and just look at this bigger picture. We've got a characterization of the initial state. And my system seems to have jammed here. I'm going to stop for just a second and see if I can get this to go again. I'm sorry. Let me just try it again. Okay, let's see what we got. There we go. So we've got the initial state that now is going to consist of, universal grammar is going to consist of that XBAR template, move alpha, and these general linguistic principles. That's what you're born with UG. There's interaction with the environment. I get input, a linguistic input. Various parameters are set of, for example, word order, and I get particular languages, a characterization of states attained, particular individual I languages. Okay, so now we enter the 1990s and we get into the introduction of merge itself. Now, there seems to be on the surface a pretty radical shift in this period from the graph theoretic objects that you see here to the set theoretic object, a set theoretic object like this. But
Daniel,
yes.
We are not seeing the slides, I think.
You're not seeing the slides. Okay, let me try it again. Thank you. Let me try it again. Okay, how about that?
No.
Share again?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so let me go to this. So this is where we were just a second ago. So characterization of the initial state consisting of XBAR and move alpha and these general principles, that's all part of UG. And then interaction with the environment where I get setting of parameters, and then I'm going to get particular I languages. Okay. All right. So now we get the introduction of merge. Now, there seems to be a pretty radical shift on the surface from graph theoretic tree structures like this to set theoretic structures like this. But we think maybe it's not quite so radical in historical context, but it does have profound consequences, as we'll see as we go along. So let's consider a typical tree for VP. Now, by the early 90s, as we noted, this is not linearized, so those things are spinning around. That can be hard to sort of put down on a piece of paper. So there's a convenient notational device that gives us hierarchical structure without linear order, and that's just a set. So the set consisting of verb and object is identical, is the very same thing as the set consisting of object and verb. There is no linear order. So one way to look at the emergence of the use of the notational device sets is simply it's a convenient notational device that's well understood. So the question then becomes, what do I do with this? What do I do with the label of that object? So what we're putting a green square around right now, that's the verb phrase, and it's got hierarchical structure, and it's also got the label in red. And what happened in bare phrase structure is I converted that to a set theoretic notation, but in bare phrase structure itself, the label is carried over into the syntactic object. So the label is going to be moved over. Notice I've got the phrase. So this in green is a phrase. It's an object consisting of other objects. But the label was argued to be necessary, and that label was carried over and moved into the syntactic representation itself. So I convert to a set theoretic notation, and I've got the label represented in the syntactic object. Okay, so there's the first step in merge. Now, the other thing we want to point out is the minimalist method. What we have developing here is what's referred to as the minimalist program, and there's a minimalist method that gives us another insight into this initial state of merge. And the minimalist method can be looked at in this way. Chomsky writes, throughout the modern history of generative grammar, the problem of determining the character of the faculty of language was approached from top down. How much must be attributed to UG to account for language acquisition? But the minimalist program seeks to approach the problem from bottom up. How little can be attributed to UG while still accounting for the variety of I languages attained? So the question really becomes, what's the least that we can say about structure? And what bare phrase structure does in some sense is sweep the floor clean and start over and ask, with respect to human phrase structure, what's conceptually necessary? What's the least that we can say about phrase structure? Well, elements larger than lexical items exist. Phrases exist. There is structure, and there's discrete infinity. And Chomsky writes, one operation is necessary on conceptual grounds alone, an operation that forms larger units out of those already constructed. Call it merge. So merge was introduced in the mid-90s here as the central structure building operation of the narrow syntax necessary on conceptual grounds alone. And the basic idea was, I'm going to take two objects, it was binary, two objects, X and Y, and I'm going to put them into a set, and then I'm going to project a label for that set. I'm going to project a label, tell me what kind of a thing it is, a verb thing or a noun phrase, and so on. So it might seem like a dramatic change from graph theoretic to set theoretic objects with the initial state of merge. But when you look at it in this historical context, maybe not quite so much. It's a convenient notational device for leading ideas. It's a means of implementing these leading ideas, what's conceptually necessary with a phrase. Okay, so let's summarize for a minute. Our goal for today is to explore the form and function of merge. We're working our way toward the current state of merge. What's the current state of merge and why? How did we get there? Well, so far we've looked at a history, a highly selective history and undoubtedly oversimplified, but we've looked at a history from phrase structure rules to X bar to the introduction of merge. And now what we're going to do is shift to the second part, what we refer to as the maximize minimal merge program. All right, so maximize minimal merge. This is an expression used by Epstein, Kitahara, Seeley, EKS over the last 7 or 8 years or so to refer to the twin interconnected goals of maximizing the explanatory effects of merge while reducing merge to its simplest unified form. Now, to state a little bit more on this, with respect to goal 1, maximize the explanatory effects of merge, postulate as few operations as possible beyond merge. Now, a very far-reaching view would be this from Chomsky as early as 2001. While merge comes free, any other operation requires justification, Chomsky states. So a really far-reaching view is that merge is the only narrow syntax only operation of the narrow syntax, and we're getting some glimmers in Chomsky's most recent work that may be possible. So merge, interacting with the interfaces of sound and meaning, and operating in conformity with the laws of nature, third factor, just is language in the narrow sense. And with respect to the second goal, we want to state just a little more, reduce merge to its simplest unified form. Basically, this is take the label out of there. So rather than taking two things and putting them into a set and projecting a label, where the label is encoded in the syntactic object itself, you just put two things into a set, and the label is somehow derived from independently motivated principles. And we'll look at that in more detail in just a minute. So those are the twin interconnected goals of the Maximize Minimal Merge program. Some examples of the first, maximizing the explanatory effects of merge. One example of that is this idea that the only relations available to the narrow syntax are those established by merge, the derivational approach to syntactic relations of Sam Epstein and colleagues over the years, attempting in part to derive C command from structure building. Another example of this first goal is the elimination of the control component. So O'Neill and Hornstein, and in recent work by Chomsky, the control component is eliminated, it being reduced to just merge. There's no big pro in a control component, but just merge. Yet another example from a recent paper by Collins and Kane is that merge plays a significant role in the morphology. So there are various examples out there, but the one that we really want to focus on is the reduction of the transformational component to the structure building component. And this is a very important work by Hisa Kitahara from the mid-1990s. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to say this, Hisa, and which I think has been maybe not fully noticed, and only in the last few years has it really been fully understood and fully appreciated, including by Chomsky himself. And it goes something like this. Here's what we had when we left off. We had X bar and move alpha, and we kept saying they're distinct. That's like comparing apples and oranges. But with the introduction of merge as a set theoretic operation, it looks as though they might wind up being the same thing. So imagine that you had this phrase just kind of floating through theoretical space, and then I take another phrase. Those are two syntactic objects, and just imagine that they're floating through space. Merge says, take two things and put them into a set. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take two syntactic objects. There's one, there's another, and I'm going to put them into a set. I'm going to build a structure out of them, and then I'm going to project a label. Okay, that's what merge does, and that's structure building. But now let's take a look at this syntactic object. Suppose that's there floating through theoretical space. Well, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to take two syntactic objects. There's one and there's another. Now, one of them is contained inside the other, but that doesn't matter. We didn't say anything about the source. We said take two syntactic objects and put them together. And the two syntactic objects that you are merging have to stay completely intact. You can't manipulate them. So I take two things, there they are, red and green. I'm going to take those two syntactic objects and I'm going to put them into a set. So I've just done exactly what I did a second ago. And what I automatically get is displacement with reconstruction. And if I have an efficiency consideration in the sensory motor system that says it's most efficient to only pronounce one of those, then I get displacement Which state did the man visit? I get displacement for free. In fact, you would need a stipulation not to have displacement. Once you have merge, and once merge says take two things and construct a new thing out of them, take two objects and put them into a set and project a label, I get displacement for free. So for the first time, really, there's an answer to the question, why would language have displacement? And the answer is because it has merge. I've reduced it to the question because it have merge. Why is there displacement? Because there's structure building at all. Okay, so merge can apply then in these two ways. We refer to as external merge, take two objects that are separate and put them into a set, build something out of them. And then internal merge, take two objects, one of which is contained inside the other. Take two objects, one of them is contained inside the other, and put those into a set. But we want to stress here that external and internal, they don't really have any significance. There aren't two operations, there's just one, there's merge. And we can refer to the mode of application as external and internal. Okay, so now the phrase structure grammar and the transformational grammar are reduced. We're maximizing minimal merge. We're maximizing the explanatory effects of merge because now we can eliminate two whole components of the grammar, getting further steps, further simplification. These components that were considered completely distinct, they're reduced to just this single operation. And that's a very important development in the history of the theory. When you put it all together, we had language-specific, construction-specific phrase structure rules. They're reduced down to X bar. We had language-specific and construction-specific transformational rules. They're reduced down to different types of displacement and ultimately to just move alpha. And now with the introduction of merge in bare phrase structure, we're able to take that final step, which is to reduce those two components down to just merge. And when you look at it historically, this represents massive simplification of the system. Separate rules, stipulative rules, whole components, phrase structure and transformational components are reduced down to just that single simple operation merge. So the transformational rules and the phrase structure rules are reduced down to this maximally simple merge. And a summary of this is given by Chomsky from a couple of years ago, and it goes like this.
In the 60s and on, there were efforts to whittle away at the complexity of transformational grammar, and they reached considerable success by, say, the 1980s. So you had two systems, but simpler ones. The next question was, can we reduce them to the same operation? Well, that turns out to be possible, in fact, necessary, namely merge. They're reduced to the same operation. Okay, now you've reached the limit, aside from things you don't understand, which is enormous. You've reached the limit of what can be done to reduce universal grammar to its absolute minimum.
Okay. All right, so we're looking at the maximize minimal merge program, and there are these two interconnected goals. The first one is the goal of maximizing the explanatory effects of merge. Okay, we've looked at one important example of that we want to stress in understanding capital merge. The second goal we said was reducing merge to its simplest unified form. These are going on concomitantly. These are going on simultaneously. And the basic idea here is we eliminate the label. So let's talk about this for a couple of minutes. So toward simplest merge, where we left off with the introduction of bare phrase structure merge is you take two things, two syntactic objects, you build a new object out of them, you put them into a set, and then you project a label. So the label was encoded in the syntactic object itself. So bare phrase structure merge is really complex when you think about it. It's got a relation creating component, put two things into a set, build something new out of those resources. And then it's got a label creating or a label projection component. You know, put the label on there, the label that tells you what kind of a phrase it is. Okay. Now, in a series of papers starting with Collins and also dealt with by other researchers, the bare phrase structure merge and label projection were subject to minimalist scrutiny. So Chris Collins, in an important paper from 2002, subjects bare phrase structure merge to minimalist scrutiny. What's the least that we can say ultimately? What's the least that we can say about merge? Well, you can't eliminate the relation creating part of merge. Phrases are a fact, but you can attempt to eliminate the label, and you can attempt to eliminate the projection. And in Seeley, following Collins and adding various arguments to it, argues for this conception of merge, that it's just two things. Bare phrase structure merge, by the way, in '94 posited this, but it immediately rejected it as too simple, saying you have to have the label. And we'll return to that point in a couple of minutes. Now, one view of this is stated here. It says, viewed derivationally, what's actually eliminated are two sub-operations of the complex operation merge. It is a consequence of adopting the simplest version of merge that there are no phrasal labels nor projection. Okay, so the attempt there by Collins and others was to eliminate labels. Now, Collins attempts to derive the effects of labels from independently motivated properties of the grammar. Okay, so there's where we are with labels. And now we reach, again, this is a highly selective history, but we're going to take this as the next stage in the development of the second goal of the Maximize Minimal Merge program, simplifying merge. We're going to go to Chomsky's paper, Problems of Projection and Problems of Projection Extension. Now, on the surface, this looks like a return to labels. After all, in these papers, we talk about a labeling algorithm. So Problems of Projection, POP, has a labeling algorithm. And the extended projection principle and the empty category principle, it says in that paper, are derived from labeling theory. That's a very important goal of that paper. And EKS argue for the continuation of movement and the halting of movement, deriving that from labeling. So it looks like labels are all over the place. EKS also argue that it might be able to reduce agree to labeling. But in a recent paper that will be coming out next year, Collins and Seeley argue that there are no labels in POP. Others have pointed this out as well, that POP derives the effects of labels from minimal search, and that's entirely consistent with the Collins and the Collins-Seeley idea of eliminating labels derived from minimal search. Now, we want to explore that because it will play an important role in our later discussion. For problems of projection, labeling, what's called labeling, that's something of a misnomer. But what's called labeling is the process of finding the object identifying information. The idea is a phrase needs to be identified as a verb thing or a noun thing in order to be interpreted at the interfaces of sound and meaning. You have to have a label for the interfaces. So labeling for POP just is minimal search, presumably appropriating a third factor principle. Minimal search is third factor. It's outside the linguistic system. You can think of it as sort of a law of nature. And the relevant information about a syntactic object, the information that's going to identify it as a noun or a verb or whatever it happens to be, will be provided by a single designated element within it, Problems of Projection states. And that makes sense, because the interfaces needs to identify a phrase, and it's going to identify it as a noun or a verb, or a noun or a verb, a single designated element. If I've got more than one designated element, I'm going to not be able to vowel. presumably it would be unimplementable. So a single element with relevant features, and what has relevant features would be a lexical item. A head, that's got features. I'm a verb or I'm a noun that can identify a phrase. So minimal search, we want to explore this for a minute. What's that exactly? Well, search is also kind of a misnomer, because when you say search, that seems to suggest agency. But there's no more a question about who or what is doing the searching than there is about who or what is doing the merging. Search, you can just think of it as a word used to express the idea of what's available for computation. And the minimal part is, this is the efficient part. This is the efficient computation. So let's take a look at a verb phrase here. So here's a verb. We've put the ghostly tree up here just to remind us that it's a tree, but we've shifted over to the set theoretic representation. So there it is. I've put these things together, and now this whole phrase has to be identified. How am I going to identify it? Well, with material that's in it somewhere. So what do I have in it? Well, I've got to identify it with a unique identifier, just one thing. And there are three heads, and there are phrases. So I've got a multitude of things that I could appeal to. Well, the phrases themselves, this set and this bigger set, have no features that are relevant for identification. So they're not going to be relevant to identification. The heads are. So I've got three heads. So I've got a choice point. So which of those am I going to take? The efficient computation, the minimal search, says what I'm giving you is a way of making this choice efficiently. And you're going to make this choice, which of those heads to take as the identifier of the phrase in a computational efficient way. Okay. So one way to think about it is the following. I've got this phrase consisting of a verb plus a noun phrase. That's a set. Well, a set has no features. I can't identify it as anything. A set has no features. So I can take one computational step. I can look into the set and see its members. That's given to me for free from just set theory. And when I look at the members of that set, I return two things. I've got a verb plus a set. Well, again, this set has no features that are relevant to identification, but this lexical item does. I'm a verb thing. That does have features that are relevant for identification. So I take that computational step and I find the verb, and that verb will say, you've got a choice of things. Take the first one that you come to. I could take more computational steps. I could look at the members of the members and the members of those members and find another head. I could take another computational step and find other heads. But why do I take this head rather than this head? Why do I take this head as the object identifier rather than this one? And the answer under this view is because this one is found with least effort. I've only taken one computational step here. So take the highest thing in essence. So the verb is going to serve as the identifier. So minimal search gives us labels, but labels, again, it's sort of a misnomer. A minimal search is available for free via third factor, and the information that it gives me is going to be used by the interfaces to identify the object. Now, as you know, the XP-YP cases in bare phrase structure are more complicated. I have two heads. Search is ambiguous. It locates these two heads here. So what do you do in that case? Well, a big part of the work of the paper, problems of projection and extension, is to figure out how to solve this. And a lot of the work of that paper comes from the solution to this. But we're going to abstract away from that. It's not relevant to our particular concerns. We just want to mention it here quickly. The main point we want to make for right now is for POP, for problems of projection, merge is in its simplest form. So here we have the second part of maximize minimal merge, simple unified merge. You eliminate the label. The label is not encoded syntactically. It's derived from independently motivated mechanisms, third factor minimal search. Labels and projection, what are called labels and projection, are derived from third factor. They follow from that minimal search. And that's entirely consistent with Collins and the Collins and Seeley idea there. Okay, so here's a summary of where we've been. We've got a lexicon. We draw elements out of the lexicon. We give it over to this computational system. And that's going to build objects that are then going to be given over to the interface of sound and thought, sound and meaning. We've seen the historical developments, key historical developments in the computational devices of phrase structure and displacement. Those are now reduced to just a single computational operation, namely merge. And what we see is the emergence of third factor. Third factor are general principles that are not unique to language. And this is an important shift. What we saw earlier was there were general principles like, say, subjacency or the head movement constraint that were not specific to any particular language, but they were part of the language faculty. They were part of UG. And what we see emerging in the minimalist program is the use of general principles that are not unique to language. They're outside the linguistic system. All computational systems are ultimately subject to these. And this is very important, as we'll see as we proceed. And one of these is this notion of computational efficiency. So the basic picture that's beginning to emerge now, leading up to this most recent work that we're taking steps toward, is you've got linguistic features, irreducible. You have to have those. You assemble lexical items out of those irreducible lexical features, linguistic features. You subject them to merge. You give those lexical items over to merge. Merge is going to build objects. What used to be done by phrase structure rules and displacement are now done just by the single thing merge. It's going to build objects, and it's going to give those objects over to the interface of sensory, motor, and conceptual intentional. And then surrounding this whole system are these third factor principles. Think of them as laws of nature. The system necessarily conforms to these laws. And then the goal is to be able to account for linguistic phenomenon in this way. Okay, so here's our goal. What we're doing is exploring the form and function of merge. What's the current state of merge and how did we get there? Well, we've looked at history now, from phrase structure to X bar to the introduction of merge. We've now looked at this maximize minimal merge program. Maximize minimal merge, again, this is stages in the minimalist program over the last 20 years or so. We've seen these twin goals of maximizing the explanatory effects of merge and reducing merge to its simplest unified form. Leading to this idea, the strong minimalist thesis, one way of expressing it, recursive merge, interacting with the interfaces, and obeying the laws of nature just is language in the narrow sense. So with all of that in place, that's the history of merge. Now let's take a look at the current state of the art in this capital merge, and then we'll finish up. Okay, so here's where we are. Merge says take two things and put them into a set, and now you're not going to project a label. We said there are two modes of application for merge, external and internal. External, take two separate objects, neither is contained in the other, and build something out of them. Internal merge, take two items, one of which is contained inside the other, and put those together. Now, this leaves many possibilities. We can ask the question, and one way of looking at Chomsky's most recent work over the last few years is that it's asking the question, can any two accessible objects be merged? Any two. Just take two things and put them into a set. Well, and then we can ask, can any output, is any output licensed? Okay, well, with respect to the first question, can I take any two things and put them into a set regardless of their source? Well, look at this case. Suppose I have these two objects floating through theoretical space. So let's take X, and here's another object. Let's take something contained inside it. Those are two separate objects, X and Z. One of them is contained inside a bigger object. So it isn't clear that that's external merge or internal merge, but I'm taking two things and I'm going to put them into a set. Is that possible? Okay. Well, it would give you something like this. Okay. Well, the answer seems to be, yeah, that is possible. That's what parallel merge is in important work by Barbachitko, for example. Here's another case. EKS argued in an earlier framework, and we stress that in the on phases framework, in an earlier framework, they argued that you could do this, countercyclic subject raising. So here's a typical CP. We're going to take the external argument and raise it to spec of TP. So I'm going to take this object in red, the external argument, and this object, the TP. One of those is contained inside the other, but both of them are contained inside an even bigger thing. Again, take two things and put them into a set. Is this possible? And in that earlier framework, EKS said, yes, following Chomsky, that just is countercyclic subject raising. Okay, so that was possible. So if we look at the literature and we ask, can any two syntactic objects be merged together? The answer seems to be yes. There's parallel merge, there's countercyclic raising, there's sidewards merge, there's late merge, and others even. Now, what about the question, can any output allowed? Is any output allowed? I take two things and I build a new thing out of them. Does what I build matter? Well, there's at least one case that we want to mention here where an output was disallowed in effect. And that's what EKS referred to as double peak, this double peak object. And it goes something like this. We're going to switch back to tree structures because this might be a little bit easier to appreciate. So consider a typical CP where the external argument is inside the BP still. Now, what EKS said is strictly applying merge. Excuse me for just a minute. I'm going to take a sip of this water. Thank you. I'm going to take Bill, that external argument, and I'm going to raise it to the spec of TP. Okay, I'm going to take two things and put them into a set, strictly applying merge. There's no replacement operation. Strictly applying merge, EKS said, is going to give me this. I'm going to merge together red and green, the external argument with the specless TP, and that's going to be the result. This is what we call a double peak. In fact, I've built a separate set and it happens to overlap. They're intersecting sets. That's the result. And what EKS argued is that this result itself, you can build it, but the result itself is ultimately ill-formed. It's going to halt the derivation. If this whole thing gets sent over to the interfaces, it's not going to have a single root. And so the interface won't know how to interpret it. But the critical point that we want to make here is that this was a way that EKS tried to derive cyclic transfer. The idea was you can't have both of those peaks, so you got to get rid of one. Okay, it's not tolerated. So we get rid of one. You take one of those and you give it over to the interfaces for interpretation, right? And in this way, we attempted to derive the timing and the nature of transfer. The critical point we want to make here, though, is here's one case where an output is at least temporarily not tolerated. Okay, so it's in this environment, one way of viewing it, it's in this environment that we get to Chomsky's most recent work over the last few years. Chomsky, as only Chomsky can do, reconceptualizes merge. He takes a step back and he sort of looks at merge in a new way, reconceptualizing it. And one step in this reconceptualization is to formally recognize what's called the workspace. Now, through much of the merge era, the notion of the workspace was implied, but it was left unspecified. Okay. So let's take a look at a few of the cases that we considered earlier. What we said earlier is, suppose you have this object kind of floating through theoretical space. And I've got this other object kind of floating through theoretical space. We said take two objects and put them into a set. Okay, well, let's think about that for a minute. Chomsky says, basically, I've got two things in parallel. I've built one thing and then the other one in parallel. So we can ask the question, where are those things? Where are the two elements that I'm going to merge? Let's call those the merge E's. Where are they? Does where they are matter? Does where they are have properties? Can they be formalized? Can we derive anything from it? Okay, so what are the objects that merge appliers? Where are the objects that merge applies to? That was unspecified. Okay, there's another way to think about it too. Where are or where were the two merge E's, X and Y, the two objects that I'm actually going to merge together? Where are they before I merge them together? But we can also ask the question, what about non-merge E's? What about other material that might be floating around in theoretical space? What happens to X and Y that aren't merged? So suppose I have two phrases, XP and YP. Well, I merge those together, but I could have all sorts of other material that I have built in parallel. So I've got this amalgam of material. What happens to the other material, the non-merge E's, when I put the merge E's together? Okay, where is that stuff? That's also unspecified. So one of the goals of this recent work is to specify what's unspecified and formally recognize the workspace. The workspace is not the lexicon, and it's not the interfaces, sensory, motor, and conceptual intentional. It's what we were calling computational space, and we'll represent it with a cube. So I draw material out of the lexicon, I merge lexical items together. Now I've got derived syntactic objects. I can build objects in parallel. I have resources available to me now, lexical material and phrases that have already been built. So this amalgam of material is the workspace. Now we're going to use cubes to represent this workspace because we think it's visually a little easier to follow, but just keep in mind that that's nothing other than a set. The simplest characterization, the minimal characterization of a set is it's just of the workspace. The minimal characterization of the workspace is it's just a set of syntactic objects that are available for computation. So now the idea is this operation called capital merge in all capital letters here to distinguish it from the earlier form. Chomsky says capital merge applies to the workspace now. We formally recognize the workspace as a set, and merge is going to apply to it. So I've got this set of resources available to me, and that set of resources is going to be given over to merge. Merge will manipulate it in various ways and give us an output. Okay, so merge is applying to the workspace. So it's going to take an input, and the merge is going to do things to that workspace, and it's going to give us an output. Okay, there's just one workspace, and it's got an input and an output to merge. So now the question we can ask is, okay, what does capital merge do to the workspace exactly? What does it do? And informally speaking, what capital merge does is add one new syntactic object to the workspace. That's what it does. It takes a workspace as input. That workspace constitutes a set of resources. Merge will use those resources to build one new syntactic object, and it will add that syntactic object to the workspace. Okay, so we can define it in this way. Merge P and Q, merge two objects P and Q relative to a workspace is going to give us the output that consists of the set P and Q. Let's look at this and animate it a little. It might make it a little bit more accessible. So what merge does is going to take this workspace as input. It's going to target two elements inside that workspace, P and Q. It's going to put P and Q into a set. It's going to build a piece of structure out of them. And then it's going to add that set to the workspace. Okay, now we're looking sort of behind the scenes. Merge is doing this all at once. We're slowing it all down and looking at the individual steps, but this is it. It's going to take this as input and it's going to give this as output. It's added one new piece of structure. That's the fundamental property of merge. It's going to add this one new term to the workspace, that term right there, the professor, the prof. Okay, so now we can ask, what about the non-mergees? What happens to them? And that's what this ... in essence represents in the definition. What about the non-mergees? Well, the non-mergees are preserved in the workspace. Now, we could define that into the definition of merge. We could say merge takes two elements, it makes a set out of them, and it adds that set. And then everything that isn't P and Q, that was a member of the input workspace that's not P or Q, has to be a member of the output workspace. We could define that. But what we want to do ideally is derive that. We want to derive non-mergee preservation. And there are various views about this, but the one that we're going to mention here is just an idea of what we might call conservation from earlier work of EKS. Once you add something to the workspace, once you build a relationship, say, you don't destroy it, you keep it, you conserve it, you preserve it in the workspace. And there are various other ways to think about this, and maybe we can take some of them up in the question and answer period, but we're going to call this non-mergee preservation or non-mergee conservation. And when you think about it, it's kind of like what recursion is. Recursion says everything that was in the workspace stays there. So you preserve it, but we're going to see a very important twist on this, a very important way of thinking about that in just a minute. But with respect to non-mergees, you're going to preserve them. So here's what it looks like now. Merge says, take a workspace as input. There's a workspace. Target two elements, okay, P and Q. Build a piece of structure out of those elements. All right, there's the set consisting of P and Q, and now add that new set to the workspace. Those are the mergees. What about the non-mergees? Well, here are the non-mergees in yellow. Okay, so the non-mergees are right there. What do you do with those? By preservation, you conserve those. So they have to be included in the output workspace by conservation. An efficient system doesn't build something and then just gratuitously destroy it. Okay, they're preserved in the workspace. And now here's another way to think about it without looking at two cubes, which might be just a little bit confusing. There's just one workspace. What happens is there's the workspace. I'm going to target two elements, P and Q. I'm going to build an element out of those and add that element. This is the fundamental operation, capital merge, add one new thing. And then the non-mergee right here, that's going to be preserved. That all the material in yellow, the non-mergees, are all going to be preserved. Okay, so we're taking some steps in understanding capital merge. Here's how it looks. Capital merge takes a workspace as input. It targets two accessible terms. It makes a set out of those, and that's the structure building part. And the structure building part is binary. There's no linear order. All of that's carried over from the earlier work that we so carefully traced. It's got no label. It's derived. The label, what's called the label, the object identifier, is derived from minimal search. It adds that new structure to the workspace. And all elements that are not P and Q are conserved intact in the workspace. Okay, so far so good. Now we can ask, what about P and Q? That is the mergees themselves with respect to preservation. Well, think about it this way. here's the workspace. I'm going to target P and Q. I'm going to put them into a set. I'm going to build structure out of them. I'm going to add that new piece of structure to the workspace. Non-mergees are going to be carried over. I have to carry over the non-mergees. I've got to preserve them. Otherwise, I violate preservation. They would be lost. I would just gratuitously eliminate this structure. Well, notice that the merge e's themselves are not lost in the output workspace. They're right here. P and Q are still accessible terms in the workspace. They're not members of the workspace, but they're still accessible. They're members of members. They're terms. A member or a member of a member or a member of a member. Those are all terms of the workspace. I don't have to include the merge e's, P and Q, in the workspace to satisfy preservation. I don't have to carry them over to preserve them. They're already preserved here. They're already still accessible. So the question then becomes, with respect to capital merge, should P and Q, the merge e's themselves, be conserved or not in the workspace? What's at stake? And one of the things that Chomsky does in this recent work is say there's actually a lot at stake. One problem is the following. If we allow the merge e's to stay in the workspace, we're going to massively overgenerate. We're going to overgenerate islands. So here's a typical island violation. Who did the man that met like apples? Ungrammatical. There's the island, and I cannot extract from that island. That's an island violation. Well, if P and Q, if the merge e's are allowed to stay in the workspace, which is what we would expect given recursion, keep everything available, then I would be able to circumvent an island in the following way. At some point, a merge e is going to have a birthplace in the workspace. I've introduced it, say as who. Now, if I can keep, this was a P at some point, and I merge it together, and I can add it to something here. If I can keep it in the workspace, then I can build up and build up further structure. I can build up through an island. And then what I can do is externally merge that who that's still available and circumvent the island violation. In fact, I have not extracted who out of the island. I've externally merged who as a member of the workspace. So I would massively overgenerate, Chomsky argues. So we need to avoid that. Now, intuitively, what capital merge does is it builds the set P and Q, and that set replaces the merge e's P and Q. And it's interesting because that was built into, sort of implicitly built into, stipulated in the characterization of merge way back in bare phrase structure. But do we want to stipulate replacement, or do we want to try to derive it? And what Chomsky does in this recent work is try to derive it. And one idea is to derive it from what's called restrict resources. Linguistic computation seeks to minimize resources. It's part of this efficiency consideration. And one case of this is merge can add no more than one accessible term to the workspace. So accessible terms appear only once in the workspace. Suppose that's a characterization of restrict resources. Now, restrict resources follows from something much deeper, Chomsky argues. He writes, not only should computation be reduced to a minimum, but the resources available to computation, the set of elements accessible to operations, should be reduced to a minimum. We seem to have a very broad principle of reduction of computation, which says that not just are the means restricted to the minimum, but also the resources. And this is tied to work by Sandawei Fong about the properties of neural computation and the minimization of that, which we can return to in the Q&A if you'd like. But let's assume that for now, restrict resources. Now, here's the idea. Capital merge adds a new member, that is the set P and Q, to the workspace. Great. I'm going to build the set. I'm going to add that set. Non-mergees are carried over. Good. But if every member of the workspace, including the merge e's, is carried over into the output workspace, I'm going to have a violation of restrict resources. Because you see right here, an accessible term appears more than once. An accessible term appears more than once. So that would violate restrict resources. So I need to get rid of something. There must be some way to disappear members of the workspace in order to satisfy restrict resources. And there's a very interesting tension in this recent work. Because on the one hand, you want recursion. Very general recursion says you keep everything. It's accessible. That's what recursion is. Every operation, the next operation has access to the output of previous operations, as we saw earlier. But restrict resources is saying, well, you don't want certain things in the workspace. You don't want to have accessible terms more than once. So preservation and restrict resources are kind of fighting with each other. And what happens is I get a very interesting result because it's the merge e's that are going to be disappeared. And I can disappear them, and I have to because of restrict resources, but I can disappear them and only them and still satisfy conservation. They're still going to be accessible. I haven't just eliminated them. Okay, so I need to get rid of something here to satisfy restrict resources, and it turns out the only thing I can get rid of are P and Q themselves. So the current state of merge in the form of capital merge says take P and Q relative to a workspace, build an object out of them, but it's third factor compliant, these laws of nature. That's the idea. It's going to obey this conservation, and it's going to obey restrict resources. And then it turns out that the only third factor compliant applications of capital merge are classic instances of EM, external merge, and IM. All of the extensions that we looked at before, parallel merge and countercyclic merge, are going to be fatally problematic. So here's external merge. Now we're going to look at this all at once. I'm going to target two things, P and Q. Now we see how it happens all at once. I'm going to target the and prof P and Q. I'm going to merge them. Merge has added that new object to the workspace. Merge has conserved all the non-mergees, but merge is able to just add that structure, but not have these two things in the workspace. And that actually follows from restrict resources. So merge just says add something to the workspace. Everything else is going to follow from third factor. And this is the result that you get. The and prof do not stay in the workspace, but they're still accessible. And now with internal merge, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So there's the workspace. I'm going to target two elements, P and Q. I'm going to build a structure out of them, and then I'm going to obey the laws of nature, which say conserve and restrict resources. So conserve and restrict resources is going to give me that. And now it looks like maybe on the surface, I've got two X's. So I've got I've got a term that's accessible more than once, but not given minimal search. Minimal search, we said, is going to pick the top one. The lower element here is not accessible because it's not found by minimal search, which is also third factor. Okay, so that's internal merge is allowed. All other cases are going to wind up being fatally problematic. I'm getting a little short on time, so I'm going to do this kind of quickly. We're going to look at this one case, and this will be an illustration of all the other extensions. So here's what EKS did with those double peaks we looked at earlier. It said take the external argument and raise it. Well, I'm going to put P and Q together into a set and add that to the workspace. But now notice this thing that we're putting a circle around right now, that's non-mergee. That's a non-mergee. It contains the mergee, but the whole thing is a non-mergee, and that's got to be preserved intact by conservation. So that whole thing has to occur in the output workspace. So I'm forced to do this, but as soon as I do that, I'm going to get a restrict resources violation. A single term appears more than once. And here it is accessible. So that accessible term appears more than once, and that's going to violate restrict resources. That's impossible. And all the other extensions are going to follow that same route. They're going to be fatally problematic. So merge was unspecified, Chomsky points out in this recent work. And the problem with it being unspecified is that you can overgenerate. Nobody noticed this, but you can overgenerate islands. You got to solve that. And his solution is, let's recognize the workspace and appeal to third factor, these natural laws, basic ideas of efficient computation, some of them associated with organic systems like Sandoway Fang's work. So we get conservation and restrict resources. And what we derive from this is an explanation of EM and IM, classic EM and IM. Those are the only ones that turn out to be possible under this system. So it's simplest merge that we saw earlier, applying in a third factor compliant way. Okay, so that's the form and the function of merge, some of its history, a lot of consequences that we can talk about. EKS in this forthcoming work talk about deriving cyclicity and deriving the extension condition and proper binding. There's a way to derive certain key generalizations about remnant movement, we argue. There are other consequences as well that various researchers have been talking about. There are interesting challenges, and we can talk about some of those, like unstructured coordination and others that we can return to. But the prospects, we think, are pretty exciting, because what we've seen is this next step in simplification. So phrase structure rules were reduced, transformational operations were reduced. These separate components were then in turn reduced to just merge. Merge was reduced to its simplest form, and the effects of merge were maximized. So we see massive simplification of the system overall. And when we take sort of a snapshot of what's happened leading up to minimum merge, sort of time-lapsed photography, what we see is the history of this is the reduction of UG. So initially, UG included everything. Anything that would work to give us some description of facts. The lexicon was in there, all operations, language and construction specific principles and mechanisms, whatever would work to give us some kind of descriptive adequacy. But as we've seen, the history of the generative enterprise is that UG is steadily reduced. What was considered to be part of the uniquely human language faculty got progressively smaller and smaller, less and less was in there. The effects of those principles derived from independently motivated components. And ultimately, UG is reduced to just merge, simple, unified merge. And now its merge is going to build objects that are going to that are going to be given over to the interfaces of sound and meaning, but those are external to the linguistic system itself. And then surrounding all of this are these basic laws of nature now, not linguistic principles, but general laws of nature. And that's how we're going to be able to ultimately derive states of that universal grammar. Okay, so merge, it's in its simplest form, but now it's fully specified. What was unspecified is specified, and we've taken further steps toward the quest for explanation. The reduction of UG is very important because that's good standard science, but it also meets the condition of learnability. How can you learn it? And the answer is you don't. You grow it. You're born with it. And in very recent work, it said that it meets the condition of evolvability. The less that's unique to humans relative to the language faculty, so we've reduced it all the way down to just merge. The less that's unique to humans relative to the language faculty, then potentially at least, the better the position we're in to account for the recent emergence of the language capacity in humans. And this is very recent work by Berwick and Chomsky. So we've got some hope of capturing learnability and evolvability, a deeper form of explanation. Okay, so we hope to have captured some of the progress of all of this, some of the excitement of recent developments in the field, and we've taken some steps toward the shared common goal of understanding language. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks to various collaborators and discussants over time. We appreciate your attention, and we're happy to take any questions you might have. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Seeley and Dr. Kitahara. But I have a little announcement to make. Before taking questions, the organizers need to take a photo shooting or a screenshot of this Zoom screen. As most of you probably know, photo shooting or taking a screenshot as evidence for a conference is a huge thing here in Korea. So if you don't mind, please turn on your camera so that we can have as many physical faces as possible. Oh, thank you very much.
Okay.
So I'm probably gonna switch back and forth between Korean and English. 예, 가급적이면 카메라를 좀 켜달라는 당부를 들었습니다. 예, 잘 아시죠? 사진 증거 중요합니다. 예. 저기 찍으셨는지 안 찍으셨는지 제가 어떻게 할 수 있을까요?
May I ask question right now? No?
조금만 잠시. Could you please wait for a second? The organizers are taking a screenshot of this screen.
스크린샷을 하겠습니다. 언니 가서 서세요 빨리. 죄송. 글쎄 많으세요? 잠깐만 이걸 좀 해서.
I don't know. So it's not going to take too long. So just
감사합니다. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Now I believe we can take questions. So if you have any questions, please ask for questions.
Okay. May I ask question first?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Ki-sun-moon from Hansong University. So I enjoyed your beautiful lecture, which was the best one I have ever seen recently. Okay, thank you very much. I like your lecture a lot, especially your animation PPT. Okay, it was very helpful to understand your lecture. Anyway, so my first question is that whether numeration, the notion of numeration is relevant to workspace. So it is not relevant to workspace anymore. So what I'm thinking is that numeration can be regarded as the first workspace in a big capital merge. So I wonder numeration can be considered as one of the third factors.
It's a very interesting question when you think about non-mergees. So
yes.
If you look at the history of the development of phrase structure component and the transformational component, some notion of workspace was always implied. And the basic idea was, what do you do with the non-mergees? If I'm taking two things and I'm putting them together. In the earliest days in the standard theory, non-mergees were encoded in the structural description and the structural change via variables. So if you remember reading syntactic structures, say variables were included, and those really are non-mergees. And then if you look at the history all the way up to the point that you're talking about with numeration, Numerations are interesting because I take material out of the lexicon and I put it into the numeration. The
Yes.
numeration is kind of a starting point. It's a set of resources. Now I'm going to target 2 elements of the work of the numeration, but I can ask, what about all of the other material? That's another way of saying, what about non-mergees? And the assumption was all of the other material in the numeration is carried over. So I think you're right that the numeration does represent a manifestation of this concept of the workspace, which is just the workspace is just the computational space. It's not the lexicon.
So
and
it
it's
can
not
be
the
the
interface.
first workspace, right? The workspace starts with the numeration. So that means the numeration is still a concept of third factors, right?
Yes.
So the natural law also consider some kind of numeration as a natural third factor. That's my second question. So how can we decide whether that, such as restrict resources and conservation, can be third factor? How can we decide whether this kind of constraint can be considered as a third factor or not? So how can you determine what kind of principles can be third factor or not?
Daniel, can I just give one comment about the numeration? Is it
Sure.
okay? Okay.
Daniel,
Yes.
your mic is not on. Your
Yeah,
mic is
Daniel, your
off.
mic is mute.
Yes. And
Okay.
that's to keep me from talking more.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make one comment about the numeration. We
Yes.
didn't really mention the numeration, but a numeration, if you think about numeration, is kind of lexical insertion or like an interface between workspace and the lexicon. And then there's 2 possibilities. One is, you can sort of include lexicon in the workspace so that you can access lexicon whenever you need it. And we can think of like one simple example, like the man admired the woman. Do we want to keep all the in the workspace? Or like, whenever you need new you just access a lexicon and get it. In the old framework, we have a situation where the derivations actually compete. And in that case, actually the numeration plays a really important role. For example, like a merge over move or something like that.
Yes.
But under the present framework, for example, merge over move can be solved by just appealing to the labeling. So we don't need a numeration for that purpose. So then we, EKS 1 point argue that the numeration like a subarrays are not necessary for this framework to get those empirical coverage. But still, your question is correct. Like we have to ask the interface between the lexicon and the workspace.
Yes.
That is a design issue. So that either the lexicon is part of the workspace, or like
But you cannot get the whole lexicon as a part of a workspace. I think we have to have small size of lexical items as a numeration. So we can. I think the numeration can be the first initial workspace. That's relevant to third factors. I think that's very efficient operation, right? Otherwise, it's very hard to. It takes a long time. We are going to take the whole lexicon as a workspace.
Right. I see your point, but there are 2 ways to think. I mean, for example, you build the book, okay, and you get access to the lexicon and get the read, and you merge read the book, and you move on to get the and man, and build the man, the set of the that and man, and then finally you build the man read the book. Okay, what I just said was, without numeration, I just get access to lexicon every time whenever I need it. And then the point was we used to need the numeration to, so for example, like a subarray plays a very important role when we talk about their constructions, for example. Those are empirical arguments. But my suggestion is that we should go back to those arguments which were actually motivating for the subarrays or like a lexical arrays. We have some semantic motivation. For example, like a proposition, like when you express some thought, do we need some general idea which corresponding to the kind of the numeration? But other than that, like we are still kind of, we don't have to commit to the particular framework. We are kind of open for the possibilities, the design issue. What is the interface between the lexicon and the workspace? Is that,
right?
one question. Yeah, the open
Because
question.
you are concerned with non-merges, right? Non-merges. Just so merges things will be in the resultant merge will be input the next workspace, but non-merge things will be conserved in the next place automatically, right? That's what you are saying. Then if you deal with the whole lexical element, then non-merge things, there will be a lot of elements of non-merge things in next workspace. So I'm wondering how when you control those huge number of non-merge things in your theory.
That is actually you are asking what is the interface between the workspace and the lexicon, and then that is actually a good question, and that's a design issue. And then the old O theory was a lexical insertion, and then the numeration was 1995, and the lexical array and a subarray is another design issue. Now we are kind of open for other possibilities. We don't, again, we don't need the notion of subarray for the purpose of explaining their constructions, for example. So we can sort of, rethink, reconceptualize the interface between the workspace and the lexicon. That is all I'm saying. I'm not really proposing any specific interface at this point.
Okay.
But we don't have to really retain the concept of the works, the numeration, which was proposed for the particular purposes, competition of the two derivations, for example, a merge over move. Those are very important analysis in that particular framework. But the framework has been switched. In a sense, we don't have to appeal to the numeration or subarray to explain the merge over move, for example. That is Chomsky's argument in POP, and also we extended that argument to A movement in EKS after 2014.
All right, thank you very much. It seems like very tempting to compare numeration to workspace, but according to Kitahara, the answer sounds like there's some sort of fundamental differences between the two. Anyway, thank you very much for the question, Dr. Moon. And
yes.
do we have who's?
Okay.
I don't see.
Okay.
Oh, Dr. Im, please.
Okay. Actually, so far I have your DELS all the papers, but DELS all the ELS papers have not mentioned about the follow-up question. My guess is that, as you told us at the initial state, X precedes Y, or Y precedes X, or P precedes Q, or Q precedes Q. So my guess is what decides P precedes Q, or X precedes Y? This is my question. Possibly this is the most basic question. Okay.
Would you need any kind of clarification, Dr. Kitahara and Dr. Seeley, for the question, or can you? So please pardon my Korean or our Korean for a second. 저 이민기 선생님, 예, 그 precedence가 질문.
Right.
그 슬라이드 혹시 지적해 주실 수 있을까요? 지금 화면에서 사라졌죠. I think just rephrasing his question, the question sounds like to me is that what decides the precedence between P and Q when
Right.
merge targets P and Q?
Mm-hmm.
That is his question.
You're right. We don't
So-
hear your words. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. So here again, like a minimal search is important. We have a workspace, and then minimal search makes members available to merge. So, for example, if you have A and B in the workspace as a members, then they are the candidates for P and Q. So the first, you have to select the member. If there's only singleton set, like a single member, then that's going to be selected. And then second, Q, you have choices. Either you go into the internal to the selected member, that's IM, or like you can go back to the member of the workspace. So you have choices. And then so like in a sense, Chomsky was arguing IM is preferable because you select a member and then you go into the internal workspace, internal to the selected member. But for the external arguments, you have to do, the second member has to be selected from the members of the workspace. So that must be allowed. And that's actually a very important point, how the merge selects P and Q. And then ultimately, we want to say minimal search dictates the selection.
Okay, thank you.
But what was it? So was the other point on actual linear order though, the
Right.
precedence? Yeah. So another way to think about it is with respect to linear order, the syntax itself really doesn't have anything to say. The merge just selects P and Q, and whether P comes before Q or Q comes before P, that's entirely dependent on the individual language itself.
Right.
Yeah. So that will be determined by factors having to do with, the actual input.
Yeah,
And so one, languages can choose one order over another or both of them.
Right.
And as far as the syntax is concerned, the narrow syntax says, I don't care whatever order you want to take is fine. And then which languages pick which order, that's going to be subject to different kinds of phenomenon.
So my idea is related to head parameter, right?
Yeah, ultimately the effects of what used to be called the head parameter have to be derived from something. And some languages, when you externalize, you can simply have a choice. The head can come first, or the head can come second, and languages just make whatever choices they make. But the syntax itself just doesn't have anything to say about that.
Yeah, so that's my proposal.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And do we have another question?
I have some sort of a design question.
Okay,
So,
who's asking? Oh, okay,
me,
Dr. Yu.
Hi, yes. So,
Sure.
so in the version with the merge with the determinacy, I'm just wondering about the timing of the labeling. So it seems to me that it has to be done as soon as possible to be determinate. To determine the final labeling. So in the Chomsky's version, it is like the label is determined when it is sent to spell out or some sort of by phases. But it seems that we cannot wait until one phase is finished if the merge to know that it is to be determined. Determined. I don't know how to say that, but yeah. So just one question about that, the timing.
Well, so if the merge kind of search members of the workspace, then the members of workspace are the sets or like lexical items. So those are can be selected by merge, and then they can do combine the two members, create the two member set and add it to the new workspace. In the old system, at one point, Chomsky argued that the merge can select only the labeled set. And that was the point, like a earlier theory. And then actually Sam Epstein argued that then you can't really move on from the VP internal subject set. Like VP contains VP internal subject, and Chomsky argues that there's no label. Then you can't continue from that VP. So the Chomsky gave up that position. And since then, I don't think we don't have that, that stipulation. So in a sense, like the merge can select any items labeled, label identified object or non-labeled identified object. But at the face, you have to determine, you have to be, you should send the object which is identifiable under minimal search. Okay, so ideally, we don't have to stipulate anything, but when you send off the syntactic object, those objects must be identified. So that's the current understanding, I think.
Yeah, but the question was that the merge has to be following the law of the determinacy, right? It has to be finding one object that can be definitely be labeled successfully, be determined. But to know that, I mean, when before the phase, the merge can, let's say that merge can merge anything, but then how do we but it still needs some direction, like to reach the final full phase, right? Yeah, so just.
Well, I mean, you're asking a really good question. So for example, like we used to have a selection, if the merge follows a selection. Of course, we want a final object must meet the selection, like a theta theory or everything, like that. Otherwise, you can't interpret it. But I think that the merge itself is kind of a simple-minded or like a blind system. You can just, select whatever available items and you can generate the syntactic object. And if you sending the right, interpretable object, then, that's fine. If you are not, you have to say sorry. Basically, the system is not that smart. So like selection is not part of the merge operation.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
But I think it is a little hard for you to decide whether about the labeling time, because I have studied about it, but language specifically, I think the time is different. It's So that's why it is a little hard to decide the labeling timing. This is my purpose.
For the question.
Right, any other question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, Dr.
I really
Kim.
appreciate
Dr. Kim.
your talk. Actually, just I have several questions, but because of the time limit.
It's okay. I think we're having a little bit of technical issue. Yeah, in the meantime, we can take Dr. Kim's question.
Okay,
Dr. Kim, please turn on your mic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a very quick clarification question about bare phrase structure, BPS for short. If I remember correctly, even BPS has a kind of the labeling concept in it, in that to take an example, to read in a book, if two elements are combined together, they form a set, read and a book, and this set is called at the time is a syntactic object, and will keep in being calculated afterwards. So if I understand it correctly, on slide 44, the Dr. Seeley criticized BPS as having is too simple in that it does not have a mechanism for the labeling. So am I confused about something? That's my question.
Daniel?
No, go ahead, Hisa.
Okay, so the bare phrase structure, actually, if you go back to the passage, Chomsky actually mentioned merge x, y yields the set x and y. Okay, so that's the simplest merge. But immediately after that, he said that's not enough because sometimes we can't determine that what is that object. So actually you have, if the verb phrase, then the set contains V, and then the set contains the V and NP, for example. So we could call that a labeled set. So by definition, you have a labeled set. Then Daniel actually pointed out, in order to create labeled set consisting of the label and then the set X and Y. Daniel argues that that's a complex operation. You first do the simplest merge, creating the two-member set X and Y, and then you take the head and merge it so that automatically you have a H alpha configuration. H is the label. So Chomsky argues that in order to guarantee every point of the merge, you have a labeled set. So there is no issue of the no label issue. But once you get rid of that, then you go back to the merge X and Y, use the set X and Y. And you need some way to find out what this object is. And he appeals to that the minimal search will do that job. And the labeling is a cover term. It's a minimal search trying to find what this object is. Daniel, can you add?
No, I think that's right. If I understood the question right, yeah. So the syntax itself doesn't care about labels. If labels are only required for the interfaces, so the interfaces themselves need to know what kind of thing an object is. So it's got to know whether it's a noun thing or a verb thing. If the interfaces need that, but not the syntax just operates blindly and merges things together. And then at the point of transfer, that's the only time I'm really going to need a label. They're not going to be needed internal to the syntax at all. And so right at the point of transfer, minimal search is operating. It's operating all over the place. And then the interfaces use that information, namely minimal search just returns something. Here's a set, and the most prominent element, the first thing that I find that can identify this is the verb, and the interfaces use that information in order to interpret the object. But on this recent view, the syntax itself doesn't appeal to labels in any direct way at all. Labels just never occur internal to the narrow syntax itself.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, we can criticize what's proposed in BPS as much as possible, but we cannot criticize BTS, if you know what I mean. All right, nobody seems to know what I mean. Okay.
Right,
I was talking about K-pop. Sorry. Probably one of your kids are fan of BTS.
Yeah, the kids get it.
Sorry. Right. Do we have another question?
Yeah,
So-
just can I have one more question?
Oh, could you please control your microphone?
Okay, just I
so
make
that-
the question simplified. Okay, so you mentioned about the restrictive resources. Just the counting. Just I really wonder a little bit just how you do it. Okay, could you explain a little bit of how you count the element of like, P and Q, and how it goes. Well, just this is you mentioned set theory. Set theory is something like, the P and Q. That time just several ways, just so you can count the way. And so just where Chomsky's, I believe there is a Japanese talk, 2020 around, just mentioned about more than one, just in double S bar, just a workspace, updated workspace. There is more than one is allowed. But in that case, if we follow that idea, somehow just your idea you're gonna be this, I wonder about how you count the counting the element for the restrictive resources especially. So that is my question. Also, there is I have
All right.
another
Could you, Dr. I think Dr. Kim, could you please wait for a second in order for the speakers
Okay,
to
just,
answer
that's it
your
then.
first question? All right. Sorry, I didn't mean it. Right.
Yeah, that is actually very, very important questions. The first, we want to distinguish cardinality of set from the number of terms contained by the set. So for example, take the simple EM case, the workspace contains A and B as a members, okay? So that's a two-membered set and a two-term set, okay? Now, if you say like a workspace contains a set containing A and B, okay? That's a singleton set. The workspace contains only one member, the set containing A and B, but this workspace contains three terms, A, B, and the set containing A and B. And now the resource restrictions that Daniel's slides actually showed as a final version is that the merge can add one and only one new accessible term. Okay, now new accessible term by definition, that's a set containing P and Q. Okay, so that is the only thing you can add. So in the case of the EM, as we observed, like it's the standard case, like you take A and B and create the set A and B. So from two-term workspace to three-term workspace. Before the workspace one contains A and B, two terms, but the new workspace contains one member set containing A and B, three terms, A, B, and the set containing A and B. And IM is a little bit tricky. You actually goes from three, the terms actually gained by two, but thanks to the minimal search, lower terms are inaccessible. So you can still maintain or satisfy the one and only one new accessible term. And all other cases, extensions of merge, like a parallel merge or a sideways merge, are in trouble. So that's the short answer.
All right. Thank you. Though it's actually 3 minutes past 12, but I think this is a very rare and valuable opportunity. So I'm asking Dr. Seeley and Kitahara, could we take just one more question? Would it be okay with you? All right, thank you.
Yes, please.
So we can take one more question. Oh, Dr. Chung?
Yeah, thank you very much for the beautiful lecture. So I'm wondering how you professors treat the derivations that used to be taken care of by so-called extension of merge, for example, parasitic gap things.
Daniel, you want to go?
No, why don't you go ahead? I'm coughing and coughing here.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that is the most important question. So like an invitation to this research program. We have a good descriptions within the, say, Sitko's work or like Chomsky's barriers framework, for example, like a parasitic gaps. And if you go to UCLA lectures, of course, Chomsky go back to those very important empirical analysis. But we now learned, if we are on the right track, we learned that the merge, capital merge, if the capital merge is doing its work, then the kids are solving these parasitic gaps, those examples in a different way. So we have to find, analysis, or we have to find what they're doing. And actually, there is an interesting proposal, the recent proposal, actually, that if you can check the YouTube, the week for Chomsky's lecture, for example, he actually argued that the control theory is now received a new analysis. And then there you have a merge, and you have a sort of a interpretation. You take two elements as a copies. If you take that approach, you can actually create configurations, which is kind of capturing the insights of the parallel merge, for example. So now the task is, we can't use a parallel merge. We have to use merge. If that's the case, then there must be a way to solve those issues. And then now some new analyses are coming up, and actually this is a chance for the graduate students to write a PhD thesis within this framework, because Sitko's work or like sidewards movement work, they are actually having the insights and then interesting proposals. So like, they are ready for the explanation. But you're right, within this framework, we have to work on those examples.
All right, thank you. No more questions, or just quick one question?
So I have a question. Can you hear me? Okay. So if my recollection is right, then it is mentioned in somewhere in the slides that agreement can be reducible to the some kind of label algorithm. Is it right? Okay. So my question is about the case assignment. If the agreement is the reflex of case assignment, and labeling algorithm can explain some kind of agreement, then we can say that a case assignment can be also explained by labeling algorithm, right? Then my question is about how the subject and the object can be assigned a case in the same fashion. So like a subject merges with like a TP, and the object merges with just a V, right? They are not in the same geometric relations. So in this situation, how case assignment can occur in this kind of even in this kind of difference?
We actually, EKS has one paper, recent paper, which is available from University of Arizona, the Coyote paper, and then internet you can download. We actually discussed the agreement and also multiple case assignment in Japanese as well within this framework. When we say agreement under minimal search, we didn't discuss in this slides actually the XPYP problem. Chomsky actually solved the XPYP problem by saying this, like minimal search finds heads X and Y simultaneously in a sense. So we are saying that is the configuration where actually minimal search finds the two heads, and the two heads in the case of the agreement one is unvalued feature, the other one is a valued features. So if the minimal search finds head containing unvalued F and head containing valued F, that is a configuration where we've been calling the agreement configuration. And we used to call that as a spec head agreement configuration. If that is the case, then we can actually reduce so-called agreement phenomena into to the minimal search taking care of finding two relevant heads. And we are actually using data analysis to extending data analysis to the Japanese case assignment as well as English case assignment and the multiple case assignment. But we still have to work on, say, their construction. For example, like T probe go down to, and then agree with the noun phrase. And there are several proposals. Some people actually argue like that there contains the 5 features, so that in even those cases, agreement is taking place in the XPYP configuration. But if you think the current framework, you can move, but landing site is always agreement configuration, XPYP. So agreement is always happening when you terminate the movement, and that cannot be the accident. That has to be some aspect of the mechanism. And we've been arguing that the agreement is part of the labeling, and the labeling is done by under minimal search. So that both labeling and agreement reduce to the minimal search. Minimal search finds two heads. If two heads happen to be UF and unvalued F and valued F, and that's we've been calling the agreement.
So you are assuming that the short movement, some kind of the movement of object to the like a old-fashioned like a spec VP, right? A spec VP, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's also Chomsky. I think 2015 he argues like the verb is a root, and then there's a short movement up to the spec of root, and then you have a XPYP configuration.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. No more questions. So yeah, I can see we still have a lot of questions, but time's up. And but you can contact these two speakers personally via email. So again, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Silly and Dr. Kitahara. And please keep it up for these two fantastic speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate
you.
it. Yes, and please do contact us
Thank
anytime.
you.
Have a good night, Daniel.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
All right. Good night.
Take care, Isa.
Thank you.
예, 저도 이만 나가 보도록 하겠습니다. 감사했습니다.
Thank you, Shin.
네. 일로 좀. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. So I will be some announcement for afternoon session. So we finished the morning sessions after lunch. The afternoon session will start at 1 p.m. So please join in to the separate sessions. Please join actively. So see you later at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.